necessity. It was built there on purpose, on water, on mud, on a small island that no one wanted. And from that impossible point, one of the greatest empires America has ever seen was born. But before the empire, there was a man who arrived without an army, without territory, without an established name. And in less than 2 decades, he turned a town of refugees into a regional power. His name was Acamapichtli, and almost no one knows him. That's what we're going to change today. To understand who Acamapichtli was, we must first understand the conditions in which the Mexicas lived before him, because official history tends to skip straight to the splendor. Octuma of Tenochtitlan, the pyramids, the calendar, without going through the mud, hunger and humiliation that preceded all that. We were despised, called the bloodline of dogs, but hunger and mud gave us an unbreakable iron will. Decades of humiliation, the kind of humiliation that either hardens or destroys you. And it hardened the Mexica in a way that no one in the valley knew how to gauge in time. The Mexica did not arrive in the Valley of Mexico as conquerors. They arrived as no one wanted them. They were a nomadic people from the north called Chichimecas by their neighbors, which was basically an insult. It means something like a lineage of dogs. The settled peoples of the valley regarded them as barbarians with no history, no city, no relevant god. They had been wandering for decades, according to their own chronicles, guided by a deity who spoke to them through a priest and promised that they would reach a place where they would see an eagle on a cactus devouring a snake. That was the sign. In the meantime, they kept walking. The problem was that all the good places were already taken. Every time the Mexica tried to settle in a fertile spot, the neighboring peoples expelled them.
We looked for divine sign, but in the meantime, reality was cruel. No one wanted us on their fertile lands.
At some point, they were enslaved by the Culhuaquins. Later, they were used as mercenaries by other lordships. Sometimes tolerated, sometimes massacred. There was something systematic in this rejection. It wasn't bad luck. It was that the Valley of Mexico already had its established hierarchies and a people, without lineage, without a city, and without recognized territory, didn't fit in anywhere worthwhile. They arrived at the islet in Lake Texcoco around 1325. The exact date varies depending on the source, but that's the range. And the islet was no paradise. It was a swamp with mosquitoes, with little firm ground, surrounded by open water for the most part. The established people of the valley didn't want it precisely because it wasn't very useful. The Mexicans took it because it was the only thing that no one would dispute with them. When you have nothing, what others despise becomes your opportunity. Opinion.
The islet was a hell of mosquitoes and salt, but it was ours. What others despised, we made home.
There they founded Tenochtitlan and lived there for several decades in a situation that was not exactly sovereignty. They were tributaries of the Tepanecas of Azcapotzalco, the dominant power in the region at that time. They paid a tribute in products, in work, in blood when Azcapotzalco needed warriors. In exchange, they were allowed to exist, not prosper, just exist. The lord of Azcapotzalco was called Tesosomomo, and he was a politician of remarkable coldness. He kept the Mexicas useful but dependent, like a tool. It is cared for while it is useful, discarded when it is no longer useful. The Mexicas, in turn, knew perfectly well that their position was precarious. A change of mood in Azcapotzalco could mean the end of everything they had built on that swampy island. Yeah. It was in this context that Acamapichtli came to power, and before talking about him, we must talk about something that defines the entire period, the importance of lineage in Mesoamerica. Because to understand why the Mexica did what they did when they chose their first Tlatoani, you have to understand that in that world, lineage was not an ornament. It was infrageramore. It was infrastructure. It was the basis on which power was legitimized, allianced. Alliances were sealed, and wars were justified.
In this world, strength did not exist. We needed noble blood that the gods had already touched and distinguished. It was
not enough to be strong or intelligent. You had to demonstrate that your blood came from a place that the gods had already distinguished. Mexica had a government structure that at that time was more similar to a council of elders than a formal monarchy. There was a chief, yes, but our authority was distributed among the calculos something like clans or neighborhoods with their own clans, their own tutelary gods, and their own internal hierarchies. To unify that and give it a recognizable head, recognizable not only in their own hinaubad, but also by neighboring lordships. They needed someone with a genealogy that no one could question. And the Mexica, with all their history as rejected nomads, had an obvious problem in that department. They couldn't invent an illustrious lineage from scratch. So they did the smartest thing they could do. They went looking for it.
Akan with humility, but with vision. We knew that in order to build an empire, we had to first buy into a past.
Lordship with a genealogy that, in that context, was worth more than gold. Yeah. They considered themselves direct heirs of the Toltecs, and in the value system of Mesoamerica, the Toltecs were the quintessential civilizational reference point. They had built Tula. They had produced a Quetzalcoatl. They had achieved a sophistication that later peoples remembered, with a mixture of reference and almost painful nostalgia. To connect your lineage to the Toltecs was to connect yourself with the highest legitimacy available in that world. The Mexica went to Culhuacan and asked for a blood lord, Locolua, to rule over them. And Culhuacan complied with a certain condescension, because from their perspective, they were doing a favor to a lesser people who recognized their own limitations. The man they sent was Acamapichtli. His mother was Mexica, of the link to the main Calpusa Haikapilai. His father was from Culhuacan, of recognized Toltec blood. He was, in genealogical terms, exactly what the Mexica needed. One of them, but also something more, something that connected them back to a tradition of Yunfe Hanuanle, Yonufen that the Yonunfe of Yonunfe Onaklichis. He arrived in Tenochtitlan around 1376. He was, according to sources, between 20 and 30 years old, and found a city that at that time was little more than a network of chinambas, wood and mud structures, modest temples, and people organized around sheer survival, palania. There were no monuments. The first thing Acamapichtli was something that at first glance might seem domestic, but which was profoundly political. He married women from all the principal calculus of Tenochtitlan, Dan. This must be understood in its real context. It was not a whim or a privilege of office. It was a precisely calculated political operation. By marrying Kustatania Wipirib al-Karid, Acamapichtli produced children who simultaneously carried the Tlatoani blood and the Mexica of all the established groups. In a single generation, he was weaving a network of kinship that tied all the populace to the new institution of the Tlatoani, the office of Tlatoani. There could no longer be a clan that felt alien to the ruler. All shared something with him, or rather with his offspring. But Tlatoani was not a king in the European sense. He was king in the European sense. He was the one who spoke, the one who carried the voice of the Acamapichtli, the city-state. It had ceremonial, military, judicial, and diplomatic functions, but its authority depended on a legitimacy that had to be constantly reaffirmed. Through military affirmed, through the redistribution of wealth, through alliances, and through its ability to maintain internal cohesion. The Tlatoani is the one who speaks. His voice is the voice of the city, but his authority depended on victories and wealth. Acamapichtli understood this from the beginning and acted accordingly in every decision he made. His mandate lasted until approximately 1395, almost 2 decades. And in that time, he built something that was unprecedented among the Mexica. The first major task was to consolidate the internal structure of government. The council continued to exist. Removing it would have generated immediate resistance. But the Tlatoani gradually emerged as the central and externally visible figure. He organized the positions, defined responsibilities, created administrative hierarchies that allowed the Altepetl to function coherently and not depend on permanent improvisations. He transformed what had been an informal system into something resembling an institution. The second was, although with a caution that speaks volumes about his political intelligence. The Mexica were still tributary to Azcapotzalco. Launching a war on their own would have provoked a response from Tenochtitlan that could have wiped Tenochtitlan off the map before it could consolidate itself. What they could do was participate in the wars of the Tepaneca Lord and distinguish themselves in them with a consistency that was impossible to ignore. Acamapichtli led the Mexican warriors on campaign after campaign in the service of Azcapotzalco. And in those campaigns, the Mexica demonstrated something that no one in the valley had fully gauged. They were exceptionally good at fighting. This was no accident. A people who had survived decades in hostile conditions, who had been used as a shock force by different lordships, who had developed Huitzilopochtli as a central deity, precisely because war was their mode of existence. The people didn't need to be taught how to fight. They needed organization, direction, and a context in which their skills could be converted into political capital. That was what Acamapichtli provided. With each campaign, the Mexica accumulated loot, experience, and reputation. And reputation in that world was as valuable as territory. They began to be known not as the people of the Swamp Isle, but as the warriors you wanted on your side. The third task was economic, and here Acamapichtli demonstrated a long-term understanding that was unusual. The chinampas that the Mexica had been building since they arrived on the islet were a remarkably efficient agricultural technology. Fields built on the lake with layers of lake vegetation and soil capable of producing multiple harvests a year thanks to the constant humidity that rose by capillarity from the bottom. No other agricultural system in the valley produced with such intensity in such a small space. Acamapichtli promoted their systematic expansion. More chinampas meant more arable land above water, more production, more food for a growing population, less dependence on foreign trade for basic subsistence. Aishi and Sansis. Tenochtitlan began to feed itself with the self-sufficiency it did have before.
Yeah.
And a city that feeds itself is a city that can grow without asking permission. Along with the chinampas came infrastructure causeways connecting the islet to the mainland at various points, expanded and reinforced. The Tlatoani forced during his rule basic systems for water management. The Mexica lived surrounded by water, but they needed to control which was fresh and which was brackish when the lake level rose, and how to bershahaba, and how to protect the chinampas from flooding. All of this required collective planning and centralized authority to coordinate the Valihelaburg. Acamapichtli provided that coordination. The Acamapichtli temple, which would eventually become the main temple, one of the most religious buildings in Mesoamerica, began to take permanent built during his rule. Not the monumental form that we all know. That came later, with each layer added on top of the previous one like a stone onion in name. But the foundation, the orientation, the permanent presence of the god of war in the heart of the city, in the heart. That began with Acamapichtli. The city began to see itself as a city and not as a temporary camp for people who did not know if they were going to stay.
Controlling the waters was controlling life. In order to tame the lake.
The fourth dimension of his government was diplomatic, and perhaps the most difficult to execute because it required maintaining tension without letting it explode. Acamapichtli never openly confronted Tenochtitlan. He kept the tribute punctually. He maintained the forms of deference. He behaved as a loyal vassal because he could not afford to be anything else yet. But at the same time, he was building relationships with other lordships in the valley through marriages, through trade, through the presence of warriors, on campaigns where they made allies, as well as enemies, He did not break with Azcapotzalco. He could not. But neither did he allow Azcapotzalco to be the only node in the network of relations in Tenochtitlan. He expanded that network patiently, without seeming threatening, because at that moment he could not afford to seem threatening. There is something in this way of operating that deserves direct attention. Acamapichtli governed in a context where the margin of error was almost non-existent. Any overly ambitious move could be read by the Son as a sign that the Mesmos needed to be reduced, and Tenochtitlan had the resources to do it. The balance that Acamapichtli maintained for almost 20 years was sufficiently submissive not to provoke, sufficiently active to grow. It was not luck or inertia. It was a political reading of the environment that had to be constantly recalibrated. It is also worth talking about what we know and what we do not know, because the history of this period is complicated in terms of sources. The Mexica Chronicles were written after the Spanish conquest, many decades later in some cases, and they went through editing processes, selection, and in some cases, deliberate distortion. The Mexica had a very clear interest in constructing a story of their origins that would be glorious, that would retroactively justify their domination over other peoples' worlds. The Spanish, in turn, had their own ideological filters on how to record that history. What emerges from that material with some confidence is the general structure, the names, the approximate dates, the main power relationships, the personality details, the internal motives, the debates that must have taken place within the Council of Tenochtitlan about each important decision. That has been almost completely lost. We have the skeleton. The flesh has to be inferred arala. And what we can infer from the skeleton is this. When Acamapichtli died around 1395, the Mexica were a radically different people from the one he had found when he arrived almost 20 years earlier. They had a city that functioned with cohesion. They had a governing institution with legitimacy recognized both internally and externally. They had a warrior class that was educated, experienced, and with a reputation earned in the field.
When the first Tlatoani died, we were no longer nomads begging for land. We were a nation of warriors and builders.
They had alliances and kinship networks strategically distributed throughout the valley. They had an agricultural base that could sustain growth, and above all, they had a more consolidated identity, not the identity of a wandering people that no one wanted, but that of an altepet with a Tlatoani, with a temple, with its own history that was being written in real time. His son Whitley Whittle succeeded him, and Whitley Whittle, who ruled until 1417, continued the work with greater margin, because the ground was already prepared. His most brilliant move was to marry a daughter of Tesosomok, the lord of Azcapotzalco, the same one who kept the Mexica as tributary sujeris. That marriage transformed the relationship of subordination into something much more complicated for Azcapotzalco to manage. The Mexica ceased to be simply useful vassals and be correct same relatives of the most powerful lord in the valley. Tribute conditions improved, o calmed. Pressure eased, o calmed. And the children of that marriage carried Tepanek blood, making it politically costly for Azcapotzalco to try to eliminate them. Then came Chimalpopoca, grandson of Acamapichtli. And after Tesosomok's death and the collapse of Tepanek power came Itkotl, who was the one who finally broke. With Azcapotzalco formed a triple alliance with Texcoco and launched the imperial expansion that transformed the Mexica from a regional lordship into the hegemonic power of Mesoamerica, Mesoamerica. None of that expansion, that empire, that triple alliance would have been possible without the foundation that Acamapichtli built, not because he was some mythical or superhuman figure, but because he did exactly what needed to be done at exactly the time it needed to be done. He gave a people without structure, a structure that worked. In later Mexican tradition, Acamapichtli was remembered as a foundational figure with a reverence that was not simply ceremonial. His name in Nagatli means something close to a handful of reeds, an image that has precise symbolic resonance because a single reed bends and breaks, but a handful together resists. Whether that was the original intention of the name or a retrospective attribution, the Mexica made to give it narrative coherence, we cannot know for sure. But the image fits what he did. He took what was scattered and made it resilient. His lineage became the dynastic line of Tenochtitlan without interruption. All subsequent Tlatoanis can be traced back to him all the way to Cuauhtémoc, the last, who resisted Cortés and fell with the city in 1521. 145 years of a single line of descent that begins with a man in his 20s, arriving on a swampy islet with the task of turning a people into something worth ruling. There is something else that says a lot about how the Mexica functioned in this formative period that is often underestimated. Oyens. Acamapichtli did not arrive as a conqueror who imposed his will. He was invited. The Mexicas themselves sought him out. They deliberated on the need for a ruler with that type of genealogy. They analyzed their options, sent a delegation, and negotiated with Culvatan. All of this happened before he arrived. This is not the behavior of a horde without direction. It is the behavior of a community with a collective memory, with the capacity for strategic analysis, with rudimentary but functional institutions, and with clarity about what it needed to move forward.
We're not barbarians. We understood the power game better than those who despised us in the valley.
The decision to bring Acamapichtli was not a sign of weakness or a lack of leadership. It was a sign that they perfectly understood the rules of the power game in the Valley of Mexico and were willing to play with all the pieces available, including those that they had to go and find outside. That combination of political pragmatism, adaptability, and the ability to absorb external elements and make them their own is precisely what defined the Mexicas throughout their history. They
Never invented the world from scratch. We took the best from our neighbors and made it invincible.
They were not innovators who invented everything from scratch. They were extraordinary integrators. Anaokwan. They borrowed the technology of the Chinampas from others. They adapted the calendar from previous traditions, religious elements, architectural techniques, and writing systems. Everything was taken, modified, expanded, and reinterpreted. Acamapichtli was the first major example of this process on an institutional scale. They took a ruler from outside, made him their own through marriage and descendants, and built on that foundation something that did not ache. Arrobile bilet. When the Spanish conquistadors arrived in 1519 and saw Tenochtitlan from the mountains before descending into the valley, they were left speechless. Bernaldez del Castillo, one of the soldiers who experienced it and later wrote about it, describes the scene with an honesty that still impresses. He said that what they saw seemed to be taken from the books of chivalry, that they did not know if what they were seeing was real. We did not know if what we saw was real. It seemed like a chivalric dream, an impossible city floating on the water. A city on the lake with wide causeways, with markets that operated with an organization that surpassed that of any market they had seen in Europe, with temples that dominated the skyline, with aqueducts that brought fresh water from the mainland, with a population that some estimated at 200,000 people or more within the city and its immediate surroundings. That wonder has roots that go back to 1376, to a man who came to that same lake when there was nothing but mud and will, who strategically married from each clan so as to leave no one any reason not to recognize him, who led warriors to fight the battles of a foreign lord without losing sight of his own goal, who expanded China. And he built temples and organized hierarchies while impeccably maintaining the forms of submission. There is no Mexica splendor without the patience of Acamapichtli. There is no Montezuma without Huitzilopochtli. There is no white Whittle without the man who arrived Rena first and created the conditions so that everything that would come later would be possible. Acamapichtli was not the most famous Tlatoani. He did not expand the empire, nor did he sign the Triple Alliance, nor did he welcome the Spanish. He was something different and and in many ways more difficult. He was the first, the one who arrives when nothing has been done, and has to create everything. The legitimacy, the structure, the identity, the direction, with the materials he has, and without the certainty that it will work. That is what it means to be the origin of something. Not necessarily the most brilliant or the most remembered moment, but the moment without which everything else simply does not happen.
I arrived in a swamp that no one wanted. I did not bring an army. I brought the will to build an empire